There's something deeply ironic about the nature of Blake Lively's case. What started as a sweeping, ambitious effort to reclaim control over a crumbling public narrative has turned into a sprawling mess of contradictory claims, speculative legal theories, and desperate procedural maneuvers. The very thing Blake was attempting to suppress, scrutiny, criticism, online chatter, is now surging more forcefully than ever, precisely because of how she's chosen to fight it. This case was supposed to be her redemption arc, a lawsuit that would vindicate her, expose a digital smear campaign, and perhaps even punish those who allegedly conspired to harm her reputation. But what it's becoming day by day, motion by motion, is something else entirely, a cautionary tale of overreach, poor strategy, and the harsh reality of the legal system. When emotions outweigh evidence, from the very beginning there were red flags. The lawsuit relied heavily on vague accusations about conspiracies that were never clearly defined, much less substantiated. Central to the claim was the idea that a group of individuals, some connected to production companies, others to the media, and others still to YouTube, had come together in a shadowy pact to destroy her name, tank her film, and smear her image. That's not an impossible theory, but it is a difficult one to prove in court, especially when your own filings acknowledge you don't have the evidence yet, and are asking the court to let you dig during discovery in hopes of finding something. This isn't just weak legal footing, it's backwards litigation. You're supposed to have your evidence before you sue. You're supposed to show the court why the case belongs in their courtroom, not tell them trust us. We'll figure it out later. Blake's legal team knows this. And that's why we've seen a flurry of strange pivots, last-minute substitutions, and increasingly wild legal stretches, particularly when it comes to the issue of jurisdiction and the role of Jed Wallace. Let's be brutally honest here. The case against Jed Wallace is unraveling faster than any of the other components. He has firmly denied having any knowledge of a campaign to discredit Blake. He was hired after the alleged retaliation began. He has documented that his professional relationships were with California-based companies and individuals. He's never set foot in New York in connection to any of these events. He's simply not tethered to the jurisdiction in which Blake's team is fighting. So what does her legal team do? They resort to what can only be described as legal fiction. They argue that because people around Wallace may have had ties to New York, and because some allegedly harmful events began in New York, though not by his hand, Wallace should be considered part of the New York jurisdiction. It's the equivalent of saying you were in the same galaxy, so you're responsible. And that's just not going to hold up under legal scrutiny. Even more telling is their own admission to the court that if the court doesn't find the jurisdictional argument compelling, they'll just amend the complaint once they hopefully get new information in discovery. Translation: they're betting on a fishing expedition. And most judges don't appreciate being asked to keep a defendant in a case just so the plaintiff can try to find out later whether that person should have been there in the first place. It's a transparent stall tactic, a sign of a team that doesn't believe their original claim can stand on its own. And that brings us to the most absurd development of all, the attack on content creators, because if the Wallace orchestrated it all narrative is collapsing, what's left? The YouTubers. That's where Blake's team now seems to be shifting their focus toward independent voices who dared to criticize her in the court of public opinion. Whether that criticism was fair or not, it wasn't illegal, it wasn't defamatory, it wasn't a coordinated attack. It was commentary, messy, passionate, and often sharp-edged, yes, but protected commentary nonetheless. Blake's new theory, as it seems to be unfolding, is that content creators were paid by Wayfarer or Justin Baldoni's team to post negative content about her, that they were weaponized against her in a campaign of public shaming. But again, where is the evidence? Where are the receipts? There are none. So far, this is all speculation, whispers in a filing, hypothetical strings they're hoping the court will let them follow again during discovery. But courts don't give you that kind of leeway unless you start with something concrete. And this is the fatal flaw of the entire case: it's built on sand, not stone. The sad irony is that Blake's lawsuit may have done more damage to her reputation than any social media backlash ever could. She's now perceived, even by some of her supporters, as someone trying to silence criticism, punish free speech, and use the courts as a bludgeon rather than a shield. And the optics of that are damning. When you subpoena commentators like Andy Signore, Candace Owens, and Perez Hilton, you're not just going after people with platforms. You're sending a message to everyone watching: don't talk about me unless you're praising me. And that message in today's hyper-connected world is going to backfire. It already has, because the internet doesn't like being told what it can and can't say. The Streisand effect is real, and Blake is living proof. Every attempt to bury criticism has only magnified it. Every filing has brought renewed attention to the very thing she wanted to suppress. There's also the fundamental issue of how retaliation law actually works. If someone complains about mistreatment on a set and the matter is resolved, and then a full year later they claim retaliation, that's a steep hill to climb. Courts look at timelines, causality, sequence. They don't like vague narratives with no connective tissue. And Blake herself said in her own filings that things on set were resolved, and production continued normally after her complaint. So why the sudden retaliation months later with no clear triggering event? None of it adds up. That's why the exit of Merryill Gvernki is so significant. It signals internal disagreement. It reflects doubt. It tells us that even inside the legal team, not everyone was comfortable with the direction this was heading. Her departure wasn't just about Donald Trump and Wayfaer's decision to settle with him. It was arguably about principle and maybe just maybe about not wanting to keep pushing a case that no longer makes legal or moral sense. And that's the crossroads Blake Lively now finds herself standing at. She can continue this scorched earth legal campaign against Wallace, against the media, against creators. She can keep chasing conspiracy theories that haven't materialized. She can keep spending vast resources trying to frame public backlash as a criminal enterprise. Or she can stop. She can recognize that the public tide has turned, that the more she tries to frame herself as the victim of a vast digital cabal, the more people will see her as someone unwilling to take accountability. That even if she believes she was wronged, even if she believes she was unfairly targeted, the path she's on is doing her no favors. She wanted to control the narrative, but the harder she tries, the more it slips through her fingers. And the legal consequences are only just beginning. If Jed Wallace is dismissed, the case doesn't just lose one defendant, it loses its core. Because so many of the claims, civil conspiracy, false light retaliation, depend on Wallace being the mastermind. Without him, Blake's entire framework collapses. And if the court allows the defendants to file motions to dismiss after an amended complaint, we may be looking at a cascading series of dismissals. This is no longer a strong case. It is quite frankly a crumbling house of cards held together by hopes and hypotheticals. And what does Blake Lively stand to gain at this point? The truth, very little. The reputational damage is done. The lawsuit has become a meme. The backlash she hoped to extinguish has only grown, and the creators she's targeting are fighting back with their own audiences, their own legal support, and a very strong argument about free speech. In the end, Blake may win nothing but regret. Because when you go to war with the internet, you better be sure your case is airtight. You better be sure you're not just hurt but legally justified. And above all, you better be ready for what comes next. Because the moment you turn the legal system into a tool to control perception, to punish opinion, to rewrite your own legacy, that's the moment everything begins to fall apart. And that's exactly where we are now. The law demands evidence, the public demands truth. And Blake Lively's case as it stands offers neither. The mirage of control, how Blake Lively's legal war became a public meltdown. There comes a moment in every unraveling story when the truth no longer needs to be shouted. It simply exists, stark, unflinching, undeniable. And in Blake Lively's case, that moment has arrived. This was supposed to be her comeback, her moment of righteous fury. The narrative that would redeem her, silence her critics, and reestablish her image as the queen of calculated elegance and emotional control. Instead, what we're witnessing is something altogether different. A slow, painful implosion of her public persona, her legal credibility, and her strategy. Let's start with the fundamental question: what was Blake actually trying to prove? From the earliest stages of this case, the intent was clear. She wanted the world and the courts to believe she was the victim of a calculated digital smear campaign that forces beyond her control, from Wayfarer Studios to co-producer Justin Baldoni to freelance consultants like Jed Wallace, conspired to ruin her. That a sprawling machine of bots, influencers, YouTubers, trolls, journalists, and insiders formed a secret alliance to paint her as cold, difficult, unstable, or worse, a diva hiding behind progressive branding. It's a compelling idea if you believe in secret Hollywood agendas and whisper networks. It fits right in. But here's the truth: a compelling theory is not the same as a legal case. For months, Lively's team has been trying to stretch, repackage, and retrofit basic online backlash into a full-blown legal conspiracy. They're attempting to take tweets, YouTube videos, Reddit threads, and TikTok stitches and use them as evidence of a coordinated attack. But guess what? That's not how conspiracy law works. People are allowed to criticize celebrities. They're allowed to form opinions. They're allowed to say, I don't think Blake Lively was very respectful in that interview, or she handled that pressed her poorly, or even something about this entire film feels fake. That's not defamation, that's discourse. The only way Blake's claims were ever going to hold weight was if she could prove actual coordination, payments, instructions, shared documents, digital fingerprints that traced back to a central command. But she doesn't have it. We know she doesn't. Because even her own legal team has begun to admit in carefully coded language that they're hoping to find that evidence in discovery. In other words, they sued first and are fishing after. Which brings us to the crumbling centerpiece of this lawsuit, Jed Wallace. If Wallace gets dismissed, everything collapses. That's not an exaggeration, it's structural reality, because Wallace is named in nearly every core allegation. Civil conspiracy, he's allegedly the digital strategist. False light invasion of privacy, he supposedly seeded the materials. Retaliation, he was the alleged engine behind it. Remove him and Blake's central theory falls apart. And right now that's exactly what's on the table. His lawyers have made compelling arguments that he had no connection to New York, no concrete role in any coordinated digital attack, and was hired after the film premiere. Blake's legal team, led by Gvernki, has tried to stretch the facts so far beyond their breaking point that it's starting to read more like courtroom fanfiction than a serious civil complaint. Let's recap just how absurd their argument has become. They're trying to say that because Melissa Nathan, a different co-defendant, sometimes resided in New York, and because Blake shared some of her complaints in New York, and because a producer allegedly made a statement at a New York premiere that Wallace, who was hired days later and never even set foot in the city, is somehow reasonably inferred to have participated in a New York-based conspiracy. That's not a stretch, that's a leap across an unlit canyon with no parachute. Even worse, they admit in their court filings that if this argument fails, they'll seek to amend the complaint based on what they find in future discovery. In legal terms, this is a public white flag. They're saying, "Judge, please don't dismiss this yet, we might be able to prove it later." That's not how lawsuits work. That's how fantasy novels work. And this brings us to the recent and significant exit of Merryill Gvernki, one of Blake's key attorneys. While her departure was initially chalked up to a broader exodus from the firm Wayfarer and Gallagher due to political discomfort over their settlement with the Trump administration, it's hard not to look at this in context. Because Merryill was instrumental in building Blake's claims. She helped shape the defamation language, she structured the early filing strategies, and now, just as the jurisdictional house of cards starts to collapse, she's out joining a boutique firm with other high-profile dissenters. Make no mistake, her departure is not just symbolic, it's seismic. And it's happening at the exact moment Blake's legal team needs consistency and strategy more than ever, because now they're not just fending off dismissals. They're pivoting to a new, increasingly dangerous theory: the content creators did it. Yes, that's where this case is heading now. Paris Hilton, Andy Signore, Candace Owens, maybe more. Blake and her legal team now appear to be suggesting that these creators were paid, possibly by Wayfarer or Justin Baldoni's camp, to post defamatory content about her. That these weren't just opinionated people reacting to a public firestorm. They were foot soldiers in a covert war. But again, where's the proof? Where are the PayPal receipts, the wire transfers, the internal memos, the Slack messages, the NDA leaks? There are none, because they don't exist, because this didn't happen. The reality is these creators were simply reacting as creators do to an unfolding celebrity scandal. And the fact that Blake's team is now trying to use litigation to silence those voices under the threat of subpoenas is deeply troubling. It's an abusive process, it's a direct assault on the First Amendment, and it reeks of desperation. This is where the legal strategy crosses into authoritarian territory. It's not about seeking justice anymore, it's about retribution. It's about punishing people for having opinions, for being influential, for being loud. But that tactic will not work, because the internet doesn't take kindly to censorship. And neither do courts when they sense that a lawsuit is being weaponized not for redress, but for revenge. Let's talk timing. Blake's lawsuit is now spiraling. Just as her reputation is facing its steepest challenges, the media has grown more skeptical. Social media, once a loyal fanbase, is increasingly split. Even people who once gave her the benefit of the doubt are now asking hard questions. Why would a person with nothing to hide go to such extreme lengths to bury criticism? Why target YouTubers with lawsuits when you're supposed to be taking on corporations? Why stretch your legal theory to such absurd degrees unless you know the real evidence isn't there? These are the questions swirling now. And they're not being asked by fringe trolls. They're being asked by legal analysts, journalists, lawyers, and insiders. And this all comes down to one unavoidable truth: Blake's lawsuit is not about justice, it's about control. Control over narrative, control over criticism, control over legacy. But here's the tragedy: the more she tries to control it, the more she loses it. She is unintentionally exposing her own contradictions. She says she's protecting her privacy, yet she keeps unsealing court documents that create new headlines. She says she's fighting for justice, yet her targets include independent media, not just institutional players. She claims to be battling workplace abuse, yet much of her case is centered on how people talked about her after the fact. And now as this case teeters on the edge of collapse, we can see the final act forming. If Jed Wallace is dismissed, and many expect he will be, Blake's case will unravel. Her entire narrative rests on his involvement. Without him, the civil conspiracy claim loses its foundation. The retaliation claim loses its structure. The digital campaign theory disintegrates. And here's the kicker: if the court allows her to amend her complaint, all the other defendants, Wayfarer, Baldoni, will then get their shot at filing their motions to dismiss, and you can bet they will. And you can bet those motions will be brutal, because they've been waiting, watching, letting her build this shaky case. And the moment she opens that door with an amended complaint, they're coming through it with everything they've got. At that point, this won't just be a bad lawsuit. It'll be a legally disastrous one, and possibly even grounds for sanctions if the court deems her filings to be frivolous or abusive. So where does that leave us? Here's what we know: Blake Lively's lawsuit is falling apart. Her key defendant is on the verge of dismissal. Her legal theory is unsupported by evidence. Her pivot to targeting content creators reeks of desperation. And her credibility legally and publicly is eroding by the day. The court of public opinion has spoken. The court of law may soon do the same. And what remains will not be a victory but a cautionary tale. Blake could have handled this differently. She could have acknowledged the backlash, learned from it, and moved forward. She could have taken a page from her own past, poised, careful, tactical. But instead she chose escalation, she chose legal warfare, and now she's paying the price. Because in the end, lawsuits can't protect you from perception. Courts can't save you from a PR crisis, and no amount of legal maneuvering can rewrite the truth if the evidence isn't on your side. So here we are, the smoke is clearing, the strategy is collapsing, and all that's left is the mess. Blake Lively wanted to control the narrative, but she's losing it one filing, one subpoena, one flawed motion at a time. And for those watching this saga unfold, the lesson is clear: never go to war with the truth, because it will find its way out with or without your permission. Blake Lively's legal case is unraveling and fast. One of the most pivotal figures in her legal defense, attorney Merryill Gvernki, has left the firm. That's been central to Blake's legal strategy. This isn't just a quiet departure. It's a seismic shift in the legal landscape of this entire case. Gvernki, who had been at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher since at least 2023, has now jumped ship to join a brand new boutique firm, one formed by high-profile defectors from major firms like Paul Weiss and Skadden Arps, and her reasons: a direct protest against Wilkie's controversial $100 million settlement agreement with Donald Trump, following executive orders that targeted law firms considered adversarial to his administration. It's no coincidence that Gvernki left at the same time as other prominent partners, including Doug Emhoff, the husband of Vice President Kamala Harris, were facing internal turmoil after the firm caved under pressure from Trump's executive orders. The firm agreed to provide $100 million in free legal services to projects Trump supported, and promised not to engage in certain diversity-related employment practices. According to internal memos leaked to Reuters, the firm's leadership knew the decision would cause dissent, and dissent it did. So where does that leave Blake? For now, Gvernki remains part of her legal team, but how long that lasts is anyone's guess. The optics alone are troubling a star lawyer distancing herself from the firm spearheading Blake's lawsuit, which many legal experts and observers are already calling flimsy and flawed. More than anything, it signals instability, and instability is the last thing Blake's side can afford. Let's talk about the latest filing: a jurisdictional letter submitted by Blake's team, attempting to keep Jed Wallace as a defendant in the case. The judge had asked Blake's attorneys to provide clear evidence linking Wallace to New York in order to justify keeping him in the jurisdiction of that state's courts. But what they delivered was baffling. Legal analysts say the argument is paper thin at best. They're trying to argue that because Blake shared her complaints about the alleged retaliation campaign with people in New York, even though Wallace wasn't there, that somehow ties him to the state. They also claim that Melissa Nathan, a key figure in the case, might have lived in New York during some relevant period. Again, Wallace wasn't there. He wasn't employed at the time. He hadn't even joined the campaign. In fact, he didn't come on board until days after the alleged events took place. Even more absurd, the letter argues that because someone made critical comments about Blake at a film premiere in New York before Wallace was even involved, that's somehow enough to keep him tied to the conspiracy claim. This is what Blake's team is working with, retroactively linking someone to actions that happened before they even entered the picture. The logic doesn't hold up, the facts don't align, and the legal strategy seems increasingly desperate. Wallace's declaration is clear: he thought he was working for California-based companies with California residents. He never stepped foot in New York for any of this. And there's no evidence, zero, that he directed, influenced, or even knew about any alleged retaliatory acts tied to New York. The legal theory being floated is that because he once worked with Nathan and Nathan once lived in New York, he must have known something was going on. That's not how jurisdiction works, not even close. Blake's lawyers are trying to stretch the co-conspirator theory to absurd lengths. They want the court to believe that just being aware that someone else in another state may have done something questionable is enough to drag Wallace into a New York courtroom. It's a reach, and the most telling sign of their lack of confidence is this: they've already told the judge they're open to amending the complaint based on whatever they might find in discovery. Translation: they don't have the goods yet, they're hoping they can dig up something later. Let's be clear, if Wallace is dismissed from this case, a huge chunk of Blake's lawsuit falls apart. He's central to the civil conspiracy and false light claims. These are the claims tied to the social media outrage Blake says wasn't organic, that it was a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by Wallace and others. She's alleging that the backlash over her movie and public behavior was manufactured, not real, and Wallace in her eyes was the architect. So if the court finds that Wallace shouldn't be part of the case, that there's no jurisdiction, no evidence, no action, then what happens to the conspiracy claim? It collapses. And with it, all the other claims built on the premise that he was the puppet master pulling strings behind the scenes. Without Wallace, Blake's case loses its core. And this brings us to the most eyebrow-raising twist of all: the sudden targeting of content creators. Yes, YouTubers, influencers, independent commentators. Because as the original theory that this was some dark hidden conspiracy begins to falter, Blake's team seems to be shifting focus. If they can't prove Wallace planted negative stories and memes and tweets, maybe they can claim that content creators like Candace Owens, Perez Hilton, and Andy Signore were paid to say negative things by Wayfarer or by Justin Baldoni's team. The new theory is this: that these creators were fed inside information or given incentives to post anti-Blake content. It's a massive pivot. And frankly, it reeks of panic, because if you had a rock-solid case, you wouldn't need to go after independent commentators with subpoenas. You'd have real evidence. You wouldn't need a theory, you'd have proof. This isn't about silencing misinformation. It's about trying to explain away criticism, and as any seasoned observer of online culture can tell you, when public backlash happens, it's usually fast, viral, and organic. If a celebrity behaves in a way that feels arrogant, dismissive, or tone-deaf, the internet will react. And not always kindly. That's not a conspiracy. That's the internet doing what the internet does. And here's the kicker: Blake's own lawsuit admits that many of the issues she's complaining about were resolved at the time they happened. She signed a 17-point agreement. She resumed filming. She said in her own words that things had been addressed. So what's the retaliation? The lawsuit is filled with contradictions. The timeline doesn't add up. And now it's all being stretched even thinner with these wild claims about social media warfare. Let's also not forget the ticking clock. Blake's federal sexual harassment claims are time-barred. She didn't file within the one-year window required by federal law. She didn't get an EEOC right to sue letter. Her complaint might not even meet the basic requirements for legal action. Yet no motion to dismiss was filed at the outset. That was a massive misstep by her legal team, and it may come back to haunt her if the judge allows Blake to amend her complaint, which seems likely. If Wallace is dismissed, it opens the door for all the other defendants to file motions to dismiss: Wayfarer, Baldoni, Sarowitz, Nathan, and more. And they'll have plenty of ammunition. Statute of limitations violations, procedural errors, lack of evidence, every one of them could push to get tossed out. And if that happens, the entire case could be gutted. Which brings us back to the core question: why is Blake doing this if Wallace didn't do what she's claiming? And if there's no real evidence of a coordinated smear campaign, what's the point? Maybe it's about control, maybe it's about narrative, maybe it's about revenge. But one thing is clear: the case is teetering on the edge. And if the judge grants that motion to dismiss Wallace, it may trigger a chain reaction that ends the whole saga. Blake doesn't need content creators to be complicit in some deep conspiracy. She needs to accept that sometimes public reaction is just public reaction. You can't see your way out of a PR crisis, and you can't litigate your way into a redemption arc. In the end, this case might go down as one of the most miscalculated celebrity lawsuits in recent memory. From shifting legal teams to weak jurisdictional arguments to targeting YouTubers, it's been messy from the start. But if the legal cracks continue to widen, it won't be long before it all comes crumbling down.